This week we'll be talking about adaptive strategies, or how people make a living. And the reason this is such an important topic is, as we'll go through this, you'll learn that it is one of the biggest predictors of similarities across cultures. And so we really have to understand how the economy is organized in order to fully understand cultural expression. We will talk about how people make a living in different types of societies. We will define what an economy is and talk about economizing behavior. And we will also talk about the systems or principles that regulate the exchange of goods and services in various societies. So we will talk about production, we will talk about distribution, and we will talk about consumption. So adaptive strategies are defined as the means of making a living, or the productive system. We will fairly clearly distinguish between those adaptive strategies that utilize food production, which are reliant on plant cultivation and animal domestication. These are things that emerged, if you recall back to our Advent of Agriculture lecture, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. Up to that point, we were reliant on natural growing foods. We were living as foragers. The advent of food production fueled some major changes in human life. And so, as we talk about kind of these predictors of cultural correlates, as we talk about how culture changed, particularly with the advent of agriculture, plant animal domestication, we can't minimize the effects that those production changes had on our overall lifestyle. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today with approaching 8 billion people on the face of the planet, with large scale technological advances, complex global political systems. None of that would have been possible if we had not first innovated agriculture. Yehudi Cohen introduced the typology that we use for adaptive strategies, and he named five. They are foraging, horticulture, agriculture, pastoralism, and industrialism. And we will talk about each of these in turn. Um, Cohen also proposed that the most important reason for similarities between two or more unrelated societies is possessing the same adaptive strategy. And so this is honestly, the big take-home message from this last third of the course. Everything that we'll talk about between the last exam between now and the last exam. There are two reasons cultures can be similar. One of those reasons is what we call cultural phylogeny. That means that those cultures are similar because they have similar ancestry. So why, for example, do we speak English in America? Why do we speak Spanish in Mexico? Well, um, America was founded as a British colony, Mexico was founded as a Spanish colony. So our languages are due to this colonial kind of nation building that European imperialism had on us in the New World. The same can be true across Africa, across Southeast Asia. We speak languages based on the European country that kind of took control and colonized us. The second reason that societies share cultural features is because they share adaptive strategies. So, we've got this importance of cultural phylogeny, yes, but an even bigger kind of predictive importance of how we make a living on how our culture presents itself. There is one proposed additional adaptive strategy that Cohen didn't talk about that really explains life like in the modern developed West. I mean, we're no longer industrial. We don't produce goods. What do we produce? Well, we produce services. We produce ideas. And so this shift towards what we call post-industrialism. We will talk about that a little bit after we introduce industrialism. All humans were foragers until about 10,000 years ago. And we've already talked about this, right? We talked about the importance of the broad spectrum revolution on changing the suite of plant and animal resources that were available, how that allowed us to become sedentary, and how sedentism then allowed us to innovate agriculture. This is really everything we've talked about up to this point. foraging economies rely on nature to make a living. They're not doing any direct manipulation of plants and animals. They're not transporting seeds and planting them in new areas. They're not herding animals along with them, with the exception of dogs. So they're more reliant upon natural resources than they are upon controlling plant and animal reproduction. With the spread of the modern world system, foraging has declined dramatically. So we'll talk a little bit about where we find modern foragers. When we talk about the global distribution of foragers, we find that foragers remain in areas where the environment is either unfavorable for food production or where people choose not to adopt food production. So, for example, there are two areas in Africa with modern or recent foragers, including the equatorial forest region, where we've got a lot of the pygmy groups like the Mbuti and the Efe and such, as well as the Kalahari Desert, where we've got the Kung. Now, you will watch a movie for one of your activities this week called Nice Story of a Kung Woman. And what this does is chronicles the Kung from the point that they were first contacted by white Western anthropologists in the 1950s to the point that they were settled in reservations in the 1970s by the South African government and some missionary groups. And so what you'll do for your assignment is really pay attention to the cultural shifts that come with resettlement. The Kung dramatically changed their lifestyle, and this had a dramatic effect on the overall expression of cultural features. So you'll get to experience through some first-hand footage what life would have been like historically for traditional hunter-gatherers. In Australia, the Aborigines have maintained a foraging lifestyle for 60,000 years without innovating food production. And part of the reason is that the entire interior of Australia is desert, and deserts are not conducive for agriculture. It takes a heck of a lot of work to irrigate them to a point that you can grow crops in the desert. In North America, we've got the Inuit, the Inupiat, and other groups throughout Alaska and Canada. In these far northern Arctic regions, we're talking about permafrost. We're talking about a context where nothing grows for much of the year, if at all. And so the role that women are able to play in gathering carbohydrates for the group is minimized. And then in South America, we've got groups like the Ache of Paraguay. We've got some groups of Yora hunter-gatherers deep in the Brazilian Amazon. These are areas that don't necessarily lack the capacity to develop agriculture or to practice agriculture, though tropical forests, when they're clear-cut, lose dramatically their productivity. But areas that have been relatively inaccessible by modern populations, and so foraging makes sense in those areas. The Ache have 90 different species of plants they forage on, 300 different species that are potential option sets. So when we talk about tropical foraging, it's a lifestyle that in these really rich areas can sustain quite a large population, even by modern standards, even in a modern context. And so you've got to really feel motivated to shift your lifestyle. And in these deep forested areas, that motivation hasn't been present. Modern foragers, by today's standards, live on the society's fringes. They are among the poorest of the poor. One of the main reasons is that nomadism generally implies that you don't amass large quantities of goods because you're going to have to carry them around. So if you had to carry everything you owned on your back, you'd be less inclined to own as much as you potentially do. So when you're settled then into reservations, when you don't own anything, you come in at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. When they're resettled by the government, they are often reliant on communities or reliant on food aid by the government. They become completely well, no longer self-sufficient. They rely completely on anything the government gives them. And so when you watch the film Nice Story of a Kung Woman, you will hear them talk about mealy meal and mealy meal rations. And so Nai gets more rations because she's positive for tuberculosis. So people in poor health get a little more food to eat so that they can keep their immune system functioning. So you will see some of these changes really come firsthand with that video. And so this image represents the worldwide distribution of both recent and modern foraging groups. So if you notice, there are a lot of groups on the west coast of the United States. This is not because they still necessarily are foragers today, but because they didn't transition over to food production really until about 1849. And if you think about contextually what happened in 1849, I mean, this was the California Gold Rush. And so this was the first time in the history of America that people went in large numbers westward. And as white people moved west, they brought with them white cultural traditions and ideals. And so religious missionaries followed who then tried to settle many of these these foragers on the west coast into reservations, viewed them as kind of communist, kind of wasteful. But when you think about the climate of the Pacific Northwest, it's temperate rainforest. It is something that allowed for sedentism in this broad spectrum economy. They've got a slew of both land and marine resources in the Pacific Northwest. You can hunt for things like orcas and other whales. You can forage for elk and deer and rabbits, and you have natural fruit trees, natural plant species that can be gathered. So this kind of habitat sustained foraging for a very long period of time, and it was really only the white people that messed it up. There are cultural correlates of foraging that are important to identify. Foragers, by and large, are organized into what we call band level sociopolitical organization. And so foraging bands are very mobile, they're flexible. I mean, they're typically nomadic. If they're sedentary, it may be seasonal sedentism, to where they've got, for example, a summer and a winter camp, and they move between the two over the course of the year. This band is the basic social unit. It's no more than or fewer than about 100 people. It's generally 5 to 6 nuclear families that travel around together. And it's flexible in membership. They've got what we call fission, fusion, social organization. So during times where the environment supports larger groups, more people may come together. During times where resources are scarce, these bands may split up. So membership is fluid. You're not always kind of you don't always have to stay with the same group of people. If there's an argument, if there's some kind of conflict between you, then you're fine. You just relocate. You just join up with another part of that social group. So you're able to switch between bands, provided that you have either kinship or marriage ties, and the overall band is fairly closely related. Related a little bit less than first cousins are related to one another. There are only age-based social distinctions and gender-based social distinctions. Status is what we call achieved, not ascribed. That means that status is under kind of your influence and your direction. You are able to foster particular traits that give you higher status. You are able to change your status during your lifetime. So age and sex, of course, you have a little less control over. Generally, among foraging groups, males are held in slightly more esteem than females, simply because people prefer to eat meat than they do to eat gathered carbohydrates. And so it's that male hunting that gives males somewhat of an edge. Older people are typically revered because they've got a knowledge set of events that may not occur as frequently. And so they offer you a unique perspective that may help people kind of weather the long term because they've lived more life. They've been exposed to more variation. They have more, may have more knowledge of the folk tales that get passed down that teach populations how to cope with exceedingly rare events. There also may be other things that give you higher status that are very specific to the individual involved. And so, healing properties, shamanistic kinds of abilities. You might be an expert bow maker or arrow maker. You might be an expert musician who can lead people in religious kind of rituals. So, those are things that can lead to people having slightly higher status. Most foraging societies are relatively egalitarian, which means that these contrasts in prestige are relatively minor and based on these characteristics that you may have some control over. Um, we see a bit of difference based on the degree of sedentism. When we've got sedentary hunter-gatherers, there may be a little bit more of a hierarchy that settles in because there can be more ownership of goods, more kind of disparate statuses based on wealth. But in general, men and women are equal. Most members of the population are equal. If you're a leader in a foraging group, you lead by suggestion, lead by example, not leading by kind of absolute